Great civil rights lawyers, great teachers. Sometimes one can be both. Just ask the students and colleagues of Frank Askin. After 50 years on the Rutgers Law faculty, 50 years of public interest law, changing the way law is taught throughout the country, challenging the law in the interest of justice, Frank's about to retire. An exit that has not gone unnoticed here at Due Process, nor at the nation's highest court.
Frank Askin was in the very first class I taught at Rutgers Law School. And as I anticipated, he was first in his graduating class.
By that fall, they were both on the faculty, and Frank was on his way to a 50-year life of teaching, breathing, living the law.
He cared about the right things, and he appreciated that law exists, or should exist, to serve a diverse society.
A commitment that began long before he was a lawyer. By high school, his focus was on social justice and radical left-wing politics.
When I grew up in the late 40s and early 50s, expressing extremist views meant you were for civil rights or against racial discrimination.
So by 18, he had an active FBI file.
I've been battling FBI for more than half a century, and I consider the FBI guidelines something of a charade.
And while the FBI was watching Frank, Frank was on his way to becoming a teacher, an advocate, a man described by colleagues, students, friends, like this.
There hasn't been a time since I have entered the legal profession in which Frank has not been my role model, in what is my mentor, now my colleague.
Frank is my best friend. He is my mentor. He is my legal partner. He is, my inspiration.
He was my professor, he was my mentor, and he was my friend.
Or, as the ACLU's Ed Barocas puts it,
there are so many ACLU lawyers and civil libertarians generally that have Frank as their idol, and their teacher, their professor. Their example of what being a great civil libertarian attorney means.
I vividly recall one day in the late 1960s, after Frank had become my colleague, when he brought a visitor to my office, Mel Wolfe, then legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. That visit sparked an idea that eventually developed into the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, a venture that consumed my waking hours for the next decade. Frank and I served together for a time as general counsel to the ACLU.
And no one served as long in that post as Frank. So his input's been national, but nowhere greater than here at home.
We have here in New Jersey the strongest protections for freedom of speech, and that is because of Frank Askin.
Among other things, his opening up regional shopping malls in New Jersey to political petitioning.
The Paranum public place is clearly taken over what was once the town square or the village green in most parts of our state.
The leafleting case was a Frank success, but even when he lost,
if you're doing it right, you shouldn't always win.
He left an impression.
This case concerns a most fundamental issue of contemporary American society: the right of racial minorities to participate fully and effectively in the political process.
That was an appeal to end the ban on felon voting, with Frank as comfortable in the courtroom as in the classroom.
This was 25, 30 years ago.
Even when it was the state Supreme Court or the nation's highest court, or even, close to home, an early fight on behalf of Newark's black cops.
The police officers right here, no, we thought we were being treated in a racist manner.
So you find Frank?
We find Frank. Frank listened, and he decided to help us. He filed suit, and eventually we won.
Claude Coleman went on to be a lawyer, the director of police, and ultimately a Superior Court judge.
I was the only person that was a student of his a client of his and also a defendant because he ends up suing me later on as head of the police department.
Everything he does is cleared with, he clearly does with the underlying assumption that injustice has to be fixed. It's not a question of whether he's able to or whether this is practical. It just has to be done.
That's what led him to a couple of stints on the Hill and 2 unsuccessful congressional campaigns,
I'm Frank Askin, and I'm asking for your votes.
but always returning to the law school, a base where lawyers like the iconic Arthur Kanoy and his dear friend Frank Askin could teach and try to change the world.
He is a firm believer that if the law is on your side, you can move mountains, and if the law is not on your side, then one should move mountains to change the law to do justice.
And so he began enlisting students to help
So you think it's a freedom of the press issue?
I do.
and created a constitutional litigation clinic, a critical addition to Rutgers and a model for law schools all over the country.
Very often law schools focus on describing what the law is. He focused on, and our clinic focused on, what the law can be.
Content discrimination angle, they can ban all journalists, but you can't ban specific journalists.
It's possible.
A place where students can go hands-on in the interest of civil rights
I'm also thinking in terms of door-to-door canvassing and like freedom of speech infringements there.
and social justice.
Frank's pitch about his clinic is it's a course where students don't just study the law, they make the law. And then he amplifies on that at his first class where he says, you know, in most of the curriculum, what you're doing is you're looking at the law as it is, and you're asking the question why. But in this clinic, I want you to look at the law as it never was and ask why not.
So it's only fitting that what's grown to be an entire wing of Rutgers clinics will be named for Frank and for his wife of more than 50 years, the former Marilyn Klein. Like Frank, a former journalist, a lawyer, and a legal pioneer in the field of elder law.
She is a lion in her own right. Her work on elder law is some of the most important here in New Jersey.
She taught the course in elder law here for many, many years. That was very well received. And as she predicted, it has become a very discrete and important area of practice.
She essentially created the field of elder law, and as the baby boomer population continues to age, they will have the legal protections that are available to them courtesy of Marilyn Askin.
Marilyn is smart, outspoken, determined, like Frank, whose last weeks as the law school's most senior professor found him slower in body, but not in mind, doing what he's done for more than 50 years.
Residents of these private communities have rights under the state constitution, the only state in the nation.
Question, challenge, teach.
That bill's a little uncertain.
Bravo, Frank, for your half-century of service to Rutgers and to the ideal of justice, genuinely equal and accessible to all. May you continue to advance that ideal in your life's next chapter.
Frank Askin, that is one hell of a send-off.
I'm overwhelmed.